Chapter 1. Prelude. Susan's fingers moved gracefully over the piano keys. The old upright piano was a gift from her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to ensure her daughter's talent wasn't wasted. For Susan, the piano wasn't just a hobby. It was an escape from the struggles of her modest upbringing, a world where the notes she played could transform her reality into something beautiful. Now at 20 years old, Susan had turned her passion into a career. Without the means to attend a prestigious music school, she decided to teach piano lessons, hoping that someday her efforts would lead her to bigger opportunities. Teaching wasn't just a job for her. It was a chance to pass on her love for music to others. When the opportunity came to teach at a wealthy family's mansion, it felt like a sign. This job could mean more than just another paycheck. As she gathered her sheet music and prepared for her first lesson, she couldn't help but feel the excitement and nervous anticipation. As Susan arrived at the gates of Jack and Carol's mansion, her breath caught in her throat. The estate was even more impressive than she'd imagined, with a sprawling garden full of vibrant flowers and well-trimmed hedges. Beyond the garden, she could see the tops of snow-capped mountains standing tall against the sky, giving the place an almost fairy tale-like quality. She felt small in comparison, a girl from a modest background stepping into a world of luxury. Carol greeted her at the entrance with a warm smile that immediately put Susan at ease. Dressed elegantly but with a kind and approachable demeanor, "You must be Susan. We're so excited to have you here," Carol said, her eyes full of genuine enthusiasm. "Lucy's been looking forward to her first piano lesson all week." As they made their way to the music room, Susan finally met Lucy, the couple's daughter. Lucy was about 10 years old, a creative and curious child with a sparkle in her eyes that hinted at a budding love for music. She was already sitting at the piano, eagerly awaiting her first lesson. "Hi, Miss Susan," Lucy said, her voice filled with excitement. "I want to learn to play like you someday." Susan felt a rush of warmth at Lucy's enthusiasm. She could see a lot of herself in this little girl, a dreamer who believed in the magic of music. Her mother left them to take care of her errands, leaving Susan and Lucy to get to know each other more. But as the lesson began, Susan became aware of another presence in the room. Jack, Carol's husband, entered quietly, watching her and Lucy with a polite smile. Jack was a tall, mixed-race man with a classic, attractive appearance. His hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Yet, despite his charming smile, there was something in his eyes that made Susan uneasy, a darkness that seemed to linger just below the surface. "Hello, Susan," Jack said, extending his hand in a friendly manner. "I'm Jack. It's a pleasure to finally meet the person Lucy's been talking about so much. She's been counting the days until this lesson." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Jack," Susan replied, shaking his hand, though she couldn't ignore the slight chill she felt at his touch. She forced a smile, trying not to let her discomfort show. Jack stayed in the room, watching the lesson intently, but his attention seemed to be focused more on Susan than on his daughter's progress. Every time she glanced up from the keys, she found his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that he was just a proud father eager to see his daughter succeed. Yet, something in the way he looked at her made her wish he wasn't there at all. As the lesson continued, Susan did her best to focus solely on Lucy, guiding her through the basics and encouraging her when she made mistakes. But Jack's lingering presence was impossible to ignore. When the lesson finally ended, he gave her a smile that seemed almost too smooth, too calculated. "Thank you for today, Susan," Jack said as she gathered her things. "We look forward to many more lessons." "You're exactly what we hoped for." His words, though polite, left an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach, as if there was more to his statement than he was letting on. As Susan left the mansion that day, her mind was filled with a mix of excitement for Lucy's potential and an unsettling doubt about Jack's true intentions. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but she knew this job might end up being more complicated than she had anticipated. Chapter 2. Sonata. The following week, Susan returned to the mansion, her nerves somewhat calmed after her first encounter with the family. Lucy was already waiting at the piano, her small hands eager to start. To help with Lucy's progress, Susan decided to record their lessons. She set up her phone on a discreet stand next to the piano, explaining to Lucy that listening back to the recordings would help her catch mistakes and refine her playing. As they began their lesson, Susan felt a surge of pride watching Lucy's fingers move more confidently over the keys. The child was improving quickly, her face lighting up whenever she played a piece correctly. It was moments like these that reminded Susan why she loved teaching, the joy of seeing a student find their rhythm, the thrill of watching their passion grow. However, the calm atmosphere was soon interrupted when Susan noticed Jack quietly entering the room once again. He took his usual place in the corner, watching them with that same polite smile. Susan tried to ignore him and focus on Lucy's progress, but the tension in the air grew thick the longer he stayed. His presence was becoming a shadow that seemed to cling to her every movement. Despite her discomfort, Susan kept the lesson going, encouraging Lucy as they worked through a challenging piece. In the back of her mind, she was relieved that the recording was running, not just for Lucy's sake, but also as an unintended safeguard against anything unusual happening. Over the next few lessons, Jack's presence became a constant. He was always there, sitting in the same spot, watching with that unsettling focus. His attention seemed less on Lucy's improvement and more fixed on Susan herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze was following her every move, analyzing her in a way that made her skin crawl. Trying to keep her composure, Susan began texting her friend during her breaks, sharing her growing unease. "He's always there," she typed quickly during a moment when Lucy was practicing a scale. "It's like he's watching me more than he's watching his daughter. I don't like the way he looks at me." Her friend's response was immediate and supportive. "That's creepy. Maybe you should stop teaching there if he keeps this up. It's not worth feeling uncomfortable." But Susan didn't want to give up on Lucy, who had shown such potential and enthusiasm. She also knew that this teaching job was an opportunity she couldn't easily replace. Determined to keep her professionalism intact, she decided to endure Jack's unsettling presence for the sake of her student, hoping that he would eventually back off. However, the more Susan tried to focus on Lucy, the more she could feel Jack's eyes on her. It wasn't just his gaze, it was the subtle way he positioned himself close to her, how he seemed to lean in just a little too far whenever he spoke to her. Each small gesture added to the tension that was slowly suffocating her sense of safety. During one particular lesson, when Lucy was struggling with a difficult passage, Susan leaned over the piano to guide her hands. As she did, she felt Jack move closer. Then, without warning, he placed his hand on her shoulder, pressing lightly. The touch was possessive, his fingers lingering far too long, as if testing the boundaries of her personal space. Susan's body tensed immediately, her discomfort clear in the stiff way she pulled away from his touch. She forced a smile, trying to mask her unease, and gently shifted her shoulder to dislodge his hand. Jack's eyes met hers, and for a split second, his polite mask slipped, revealing a hint of something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. What neither Jack nor Susan realized at that moment was that her phone, still recording the lesson, had captured everything: the touch, the subtle shift in Susan's expression from friendly to uncomfortable. Later that evening, Susan replayed the recording to review Lucy's performance, but her focus quickly shifted when she saw the moment Jack's hand touched her shoulder. Her discomfort was so clear on the screen, and the weight of what she had captured began to sink in. This was no longer just a tool for Lucy's progress, it was evidence. Shaken, she immediately messaged her friend, sharing the video clip and describing what had happened. "He touched me today," she wrote, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. "It was weird and uncomfortable, and I think I have it all on video." Her friend's response was swift and forceful. You need to confront him, Susan. Use that video. He can't just get away with this. Make him pay for what he did. He's got money, right? Bribe him if you have to." Susan stared at the screen, the wheels in her mind turning. Her friend's words echoed in her thoughts. Make him pay. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of control over the situation. This evidence could be her ticket out of this mess, a way to put Jack in his place, as he's getting more comfortable and crossing more lines. She knew then what she needed to do next. Chapter 3. Waltz. The following lesson began like any other, with Lucy eagerly awaiting her time at the piano and Susan guiding her through a new piece. Susan tried to focus on Lucy's progress, but she couldn't shake the weight of what had happened in the last lesson. Jack's touch, the way his hand lingered on her shoulder, it played over and over in her mind, filling her with unease. She knew she wasn't imagining things, and that knowledge made her feel both nervous and resolute. As Lucy struggled with a tricky sequence, Jack, as usual, hovered too close. During this same private moment, he leaned toward Susan, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone. "You know, Susan," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a hint of something unsettling, "I could give you anything you want, anything at all. You just have to ask." His words were laced with suggestion, his tone more flirty than professional, and the way he looked at her made Susan's skin crawl. She felt trapped, standing there between his advances and Lucy's innocent curiosity. But unlike before, this time Susan wasn't entirely defenseless. She knew she had something he didn't, a piece of evidence that could bring his manipulative games crashing down. She forced a polite smile, swallowing the bitter taste of his offer. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Jack," she said, her voice calm but distant. Inside, her thoughts were racing. She had to bide her time, had to make sure the moment she confronted him was on her terms, not his. As Lucy's lesson ended, she gave the young girl a warm smile and gently suggested they finish up for the day. "Lucy, you did great today. Keep practicing that piece and we'll make it even better next time," Susan said, her tone light and encouraging. Lucy beamed at her, unaware of the silent battle about to unfold between her father and her teacher. As soon as Lucy left the room, Susan turned to Jack, her expression shifting from friendly to serious. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and played the video. The clip showed everything: his hand on her shoulder, her obvious discomfort, and his flirty comment about giving her anything she wanted. Jack's face went pale as the reality of the situation hit him. His confident smile faltered, and for the first time, Susan saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm not here to play games, Jack," she said, emphasizing his name as if to strip away his power. "I have everything I need to expose you, to your wife, to your friends, to anyone who'll listen. But I'm willing to keep this to myself, on one condition." Jack swallowed hard, his expression turning from shock to guarded resignation. "What do you want?" Susan's gaze drifted to the grand piano in the corner of the room, its glossy surface reflecting the sunlight streaming in from the windows. She let the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of her demand before finally speaking. "I want a piano. A specific piano, a $100,000 piano. If you buy it for me, I'll keep this recording between us." Jack's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he realized he had no leverage left. For a moment, he seemed ready to argue, to fight back, but he knew he was cornered. Slowly, he nodded, the fight draining out of him. "Fine," he said, almost spitting out the word. "You'll have your piano." Susan smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of satisfaction, knowing she had taken control of the situation. Chapter 4. Grand Piano. A few days ahead, Carol had decided to treat herself to a day out, wandering through the mall in search of something to lift her spirits. As she strolled past the rows of shops, she noticed a familiar face in the window of the music store, a longtime vendor friend who always greeted her with a smile. "Carol, what a surprise," the vendor said, stepping out to greet her. "I saw your husband, Jack, just a few days ago. He bought the most stunning piano we've ever had in this store, a beautiful Hassler 210 grand piano." Carol's face lit up with surprise. "Jack? A piano? That's unexpected," she said, trying to mask her confusion with a polite smile. She didn't want to reveal that she had no idea Jack was even interested in buying a piano, let alone a high-end one. The vendor's enthusiasm only grew as he continued. "Oh yes. It's not just any piano, it's a grand beauty, the kind that only serious musicians go for. The craftsmanship alone is remarkable, and the price tag. Well, let's just say it's the kind of purchase that makes a statement." Carol tried to laugh lightly, though her thoughts were now racing. "A statement, you say? I'm curious, how much does a piano like that cost?" she asked, hoping her voice sounded casual. When the vendor responded, "Oh, about $100,000, Carol's vision seemed to blur. She felt the ground sway beneath her feet as the number echoed in her mind. $100,000. Her husband had spent that kind of money without even mentioning it to her. As the vendor continued to talk, her mind raced to piece it all together. The vendor noticed Carol's sudden paleness and quickly grabbed a bottle of water, helping her sit down on a nearby bench. "Are you all right, Carol? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his face full of concern. Carol took a few sips of the water, her mind still spinning from the shock. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "Just a bit dizzy, that's all." As the vendor left to help another customer, Carol pulled out her phone with trembling hands and opened her banking app. She stared at the screen in disbelief as she confirmed her worst fear. A transaction for $100,000 had been deducted from their account. Her mind began to connect the dots, and her thoughts zeroed in on one single word: piano. And then it hit her like a punch to the gut. Who else would he buy a piano for? Piano, piano, piano teacher? She whispered to herself, feeling the pieces of the puzzle slide into place. Her eyes narrowed as she thought of Susan, the young and talented piano teacher who had recently entered their lives. The way Jack had been behaving lately, always so attentive to Susan's lessons, suddenly took on a whole new meaning. Her suspicion turned into a boiling anger, fueled by the humiliation of what she now believed to be true, that her husband was using their money to impress the piano teacher. Carol's hands clenched into fists as she imagined the betrayal, the lies, the audacity of it all. She decided right then and there to confront Susan directly. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As Carol's car screeched to a halt outside Susan's modest house, she was met with a sight that made her blood boil even more. The grand piano was being lifted off a delivery truck, its glossy black surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. Delivery men in uniform were carefully maneuvering the massive instrument onto a dolly, preparing to wheel it into Susan's home. Susan stood outside, anxiously directing the movers on where to place the piano, her focus entirely on the grand spectacle. At that moment, Susan's eyes met Carol's furious gaze. She could see the storm of betrayal and anger brewing in Carol's expression as she stormed up the pathway. For a second, Susan froze, her mind flashing to the plan she had made, to keep the recording a secret. She knew this confrontation was inevitable, but not like this, not so soon. "Uh-oh," Susan muttered under her breath, a wave of panic surging through her as she realized that hiding the truth was no longer an option. Carol's eyes were locked on her, blazing with accusations, and there was no escape. The only thing Susan could do now was face the music. Carol was already yelling as she crossed the distance between them, her voice trembling with fury. "You must have some nerve to take." Without a word, and with no time to think, Susan reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and held it up to Carol's face. The screen was already glowing with the incriminating video, the recording of Jack's hand on her shoulder, his leering words about giving her anything she wanted, and her own visible discomfort as she recoiled from his touch. Carol's voice died in her throat as she watched the footage, the truth unraveling before her eyes. The delivery men continued their work in the background, unaware of the intense drama playing out between the two women. The recording left no room for misinterpretation. The rage in Carol's eyes shifted to something colder and more calculating. She let out a shaky breath, her face hardening as she processed what she was seeing. All the anger she had initially aimed at Susan was now redirected towards the true target. "I can't believe he thought he could keep this hidden from me." Susan gave a small, sad nod, still shaken by how quickly things had spiraled out of her control. Without another word, Carol turned on her heel and marched back to her car, her mind already racing with thoughts of revenge. She knew exactly what she needed to do next. She wasn't going to let Jack get away with this. He would face the consequences of his actions in the most public way possible. As Susan watched Carol drive away, the grand piano was finally wheeled into her home. She couldn't help but let out a deep breath, a mix of relief and fear flooding her senses. The plan to keep the recording hidden was no longer in her hands. But in a strange way, showing the evidence had become the only way to protect herself from the chaos Jack had unleashed. Chapter 5. Rhapsody. Back at her own home, Carol slammed the door behind her, the video of Jack's betrayal still echoing in her mind. The sight of his hand on Susan's shoulder, the leering expression, and the manipulative offer he made, every detail burned into her memory. She had driven away from Susan's house in a haze, the anger within her now replaced by a cold, calculated determination. There was no denying the truth. Jack's betrayal was laid out right in front of her, and there was no way she would let him get away with this. This was no longer just about their marriage. This was about her reclaiming her dignity and destroying the lie he'd built around them. Without a second thought, she dialed a close friend who happened to be a journalist at a local news outlet. Carol knew the power of public exposure, and she was going to use it to make sure Jack's face was plastered across every screen in town, and that she would still get the best out of this situation. By the time Jack arrived home that evening, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him, Carol was already in the living room, sitting as still as a statue, her eyes locked on the front door. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound seem louder, every second stretch longer. When Jack walked in and saw her sitting there, he gave her a smile that seemed forced, almost as if he was hiding something. "Hey, honey," he said, taking off his jacket. "You look a little tense. Everything okay?" "Do I look okay?" Carol's voice was like ice, her eyes piercing through him. She held up her phone, and with a single tap, she played the video. Jack's face went from confusion to shock as he watched his own betrayal unfold on the screen. He stood frozen, his smile fading into a mask of horror as the reality of what was happening dawned on him. "You thought you could buy her silence with a piano?" Carol spat the words out like they were poison. "Did you think I'd never find out? Did you honestly think you could keep this from me?" Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was utterly trapped, caught in his own web of lies with no way to untangle himself. "Carol, I can explain," he stammered, taking a step forward, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Explain?" She said, "No, Jack, there's nothing you can say that I want to hear. I'm done with your lies, and so is everyone else." With that, she reached for her laptop on the table and in one swift motion, hit send. The video of Jack's inappropriate behavior was sent to all their contacts and posted on her social media. It was out there now, and there was no taking it back. The world was about to see Jack for who he really was. The fallout from the video was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Jack's phone was flooded with messages and calls. News outlets picked up the story, splashing his face across screens, labeling him as the man who abused his power to exploit a young piano teacher. His reputation, carefully built over years of influence and charm, was now crumbling into dust. As Carol watched the chaos unfold from her living room, she felt a mixture of anger and satisfaction. This was the justice she needed, the closure she deserved. She had taken back control of her life in the most public way possible, exposing Jack's betrayal for everyone to see. Jack, meanwhile, was left in the ruins of his shattered life. His colleagues distanced themselves, business partners withdrew their deals, and even his closest friends turned their backs on him. He had become a pariah, all because he thought he could manipulate his way through life without consequences. The look of defeat on his face was almost pitiable as he realized there was no way to rebuild what he'd destroyed. As the legal implications of his actions became clear, Jack was soon faced with a criminal investigation for harassment and misconduct. The video was irrefutable evidence of his inappropriate behavior, and the authorities wasted no time in bringing charges against him. He was arrested, his mugshot now the latest addition to his public disgrace, and he faced the prospect of prison time. Back at the mansion, Lucy remained unaware of the full extent of her father's actions, though she sensed the tension in the house. Carol made a silent vow to keep Lucy's life as stable as possible, to protect her daughter from the ugliness of Jack's downfall. As Carol looked at the empty grand piano in the corner of the room, she felt a strange sense of peace. Chapter 6. Concerto. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about the strength to stand up and refuse to be a victim. Months had passed since the storm of Jack's scandal. The mansion, once filled with whispers of deceit and manipulation, was now a quiet place where the past seemed to echo faintly in its empty halls. Jack had been sentenced to prison, his once influential life reduced to a series of regrets and lost opportunities. Carol, now standing on her own, was in the process of rebuilding her life with dignity and strength, focusing on what mattered most, her daughter Lucy. Amidst this upheaval, Susan's life had taken a dramatic turn. The grand piano that once symbolized Jack's attempt to control her had now become a beacon of her success. She was no longer just the piano teacher who had been manipulated. She was now preparing for the biggest moment of her career, a grand recital at the City Hall, a performance that would define her as a rising star in the world of classical music. The lights dimmed in the grand City Hall. The audience fell silent, all eyes fixed on the stage. Susan walked out, dressed elegantly, her posture straight and her expression serene. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes. The music flowed from her heart, each note telling a piece of her story, the struggle, the resilience, the ultimate triumph over those who tried to silence her. The audience watched in awe as her fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, her soul shining through every chord she played. When the last note lingered in the air, the hall erupted into applause. The audience rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, and throwing flowers onto the stage. Susan stood up, her chest rising and falling with the deep breath she took in. She accepted the bouquet of roses that someone handed her, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude and pride. She took a moment to speak to the audience, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "Tonight is not just about music," she said, her words echoing through the hall. "It's about respect. It's about dignity. It's about the courage to stand up for ourselves when the world tries to silence us. We all deserve to be treated with kindness and fairness, no matter where we come from or who we are." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I want to dedicate this performance to everyone who's ever felt powerless, who's ever been told that they're not enough or that they have to accept less than they deserve. You are enough. You deserve to be treated with respect and to have your voice heard." As the applause began to fade, Susan gave one last smile to the audience, her heart full. She had not only survived, she had thrived. Her story was no longer about the piano she had been bribed with, but about the life she had built out of courage, resilience, and self-respect. And that's how one woman's determination turned a billionaire's betrayal into a moment of reckoning. Do you agree with how Susan handled the situation? What was your favorite moment in this story? And do you think Carol was right to take matters into her own hands? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this powerful tale of resilience and revenge captivated you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into human nature. Thanks for watching.